Hi everyone, my name is Holly Stoneberg and I'm the Education Program Coordinator for Portage Park District, and I'm excited to talk about invasive instigators with you. As we do every time, we're going to pause and talk about our mission, but while I do that, I'd encourage you to either scan this QR code or go to the website, portageparkdistrict.org, and get yourself signed up for the newsletter if you're not already. It comes out the first Thursday of every month, and it has information about the park calendar and education events, as well as other pertinent information about what's going on in your Portage Parks right now. But our mission is to conserve Portage County's natural heritage and provide opportunities for its appreciation and enjoyment. And the main word in that is to conserve. And with these invasive instigators, that's a battle we're always fighting because you have to remove the invasives, manage the natives that are there, and make sure that there's a balance and that we're always on the winning side of it. Before we get into invasives, there's a couple words that I want to clarify to make the rest of this a little bit easier, right? So when we say native, those are plants that are occurring naturally in the area and have evolved with the other flora and fauna in the area. So these have been found here for many, 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 many years, right? Years and years, years, thousands of years. They've evolved here, and they've co-evolved with the other organisms that are in the area, right? They depend on other organisms for their success, and other organisms depend on them for their success as well. So they're meant to be here. They provide either habitat or food or whatever the case may be to the animals that live in the area. So they're good. We want them to thrive and not be taken over here. The next word is non-native. So these are things that don't occur naturally in the area, but for some reason or another, they're here now. They're introduced, which is another word you might hear, but they're not necessarily causing a negative effect on the area. One example would be a dandelion, right? And I know if you like a really green yard, you might consider dandelions invasive, but because they're not considered invasive in every habitat, that's why they're not listed under the invasive title. So non-native, they're not from here, but they're not necessarily causing harm. And then invasive is what we're talking about tonight. So these aren't from here naturally. They haven't co-evolved with the other plants and animals that are here, and they're causing harm. They're either taking over habitat, destroying habitat, or using up the nutrients that our native plants and animals would otherwise be using. So that's our focus tonight. Let's get right into it. So one that we're probably all familiar with if you spend any time outside is garlic mustard. This was introduced from Europe as a kitchen herb, right? Because it is edible. So they brought it over in their gardens and in their herb gardens in order to use in the kitchen. But once it got out into the wild, then it really does take over. This is a plant with a 2-year life cycle. The first year it comes up, it's going to be in these little rosettes close to the ground. And then the second year it bolts and it's going to shoot up and produce these white flowers that you might see. Because it is in the mustard family, there are 4 flowers that's indicative of that family. And then it does have these heart-shaped leaves that you might see, right? Um, Even though it is edible and you can go ahead and pick it up and make something like pesto out of it, it's problematic in our native areas because of a variety of reasons, right? It comes up earlier. Um, well, I guess if we do a blanket statement, invasives are bad in general because they do generally come up earlier. And because they come up earlier, they get a head start on taking nutrients, taking space, taking sunlight, and they're taking all of those things from our native plants. And these guys are no exception. Another thing that makes them really tough is the fact that they release toxins into the soil that are going to be problematic for um, our, our fungus and our other, what's the word? Mycorrhizal communities, right? So those fungi that have a beneficial relationship with our other native plants, this garlic mustard is going to kill the fungi, and they're no longer going to be there to help the native plants that are around. Another problem that we found with garlic mustard is that it misplaces the Western or West Virginia white butterfly. So this is a butterfly that now I believe is state listed as endangered, but its host plant are the toothworts, which do look pretty similar to these, at least similar enough to trick the West Virginia white butterfly, right? So instead of laying the eggs on the toothwort family, they lay it on garlic mustard, and it is toxic to the caterpillars and they end up dying, right? They cannot go on through their metamorphosis because they don't make it that far. So now West Virginia white butterflies are state listed. So that's just one of many reasons why this is problematic. So if you've seen it around, you've seen this, what some would consider a pretty white flower. You can pick it, make garlic mustard out of it. We do a challenge every year in May. That's the best time to be eradicating it from the parks. We do a challenge with other local park districts and to see who can pull the most, right? Which is unfortunate because then you're just seeing who has the most invasive species. But any little bit helps, right? So we had maybe last year 8 people out for 3 or 4 hours, and we pulled over 700 pounds of it. And you know, plants aren't heavy, right? So to get over 700 pounds, you had to pull quite a few plants. So, and there's always more to do. So consider joining us next May as well. Another one is buckthorn, right? And it's called that because its terminal buds are actually modified thorns. And it was originally planted in the US as a privacy hedge because it is really easy or really good at growing thick and wide, and it can easily take over fence rows and neglected areas because it just spreads out and continues to grow. It can reach up to 15 feet high as well. One of the things you use to identify it, when we talk about any plants, right? The first question we ask is it opposite or is it alternate? And that's talking about the leaf arrangement or branch arrangement on the plant. So this one, for the most part, is opposite, but it can also be sub-opposite, which means it's not quite opposite, but it's not quite alternate either, which is interesting. And another key characteristic is that when you look at the leaves, the vein are what's coming out of the sides, and then you see that midrib is that long line that goes down the middle of the leaf. So if you look at the veins from the perspective of the midrib, they don't line up, right? It looks like they're in every other kind of order, right? They don't line up together. So that's another way to identify this plant. Another thing to note about buckthorn is that it is dioecious, which means that the male and female flowers are on different plants, so they will need 2 plants in order to reproduce, right? But if they are successful and their flowers get pollinated, then they're going to make these large clumps of black fruit by the end of the summer, which obviously birds are going to love. But it's problematic because this fruit actually has a strong laxative effect on birds, right? So if you're a plant, that's actually a really smart tactic because a bird will eat your fruit, and then if it's has a laxative effect, it's going to get it out of that bird faster, which means that your seeds are almost guaranteed to be planted. But this is problematic because in small birds, it can produce such a strong laxative effect that it can be lethal, right? So not only is it taking over natural areas from other plants, it can also be killing our birds that are eating the berries. Moving on to multiflora rose, which is another familiar name. It was introduced from Japan as an ornamental for obvious reasons, right? It is very pretty. But the spread of it continued even more so in the 1930s because it was used as a living fence. So obviously, since it is a rose, it has thorns, and if you were to plant this along the edge of your field, that has the ability to keep your animals in because they're not going to want to push through this thick, dense plant that has a lot of thorns on it, right? And because of those thorns, that's another reason why it's so problematic to remove. It gets its name, multiflora, because it has many flowers. So if you look at that picture on the right, they look like large white flowers. But if you take a close-up look, you can just see it's clumps of many white flowers. And they do have leaflets, right? When we talk about leaflets, or leaves. If you think about an oak or a maple leaf, that's just one leaf. Some of our plants, their leaf is made up of many little leaflets, and this is one of them as well. They can have between 5 and 11 leaflets that are usually oval shaped. And then the fruits are called rose hips. You might have tried them. They are edible. In my opinion, it tastes like a raisin. So use that information as you want if you want to consume them. But each one of those rose hips has between 6 and 12 seeds. So if you do the rough math, one bush can produce over 500,000 seeds every year. And each of those seeds can remain viable in the soil for 10 to 20 years, right? So even if it's not in the best condition right now, those seeds can tough it out and wait and pop up in years to come, right? Which makes this really a problematic plant to remove. Continuing on, we'll get to autumn olive. You'll see this around. Um, Especially, I think I see it the most at Trail Lake Park, or maybe even a little at the front of Shaw Woods. It was introduced from Asia as erosion control because of its ability to bush out. It does have small, smooth, dark green leaves, and it can get up to about 20 feet tall, so it can be pretty big, right? It does produce these really fragrant yellow flowers, which have a pleasant smell, and then later in the season, they'll be replaced by a fruit that is edible, and I've heard are quite good. So, um, but the fact that this is invasive means that um, it can produce a lot of fruit, right? They're prolific. And the problem with these specifically are, even if you cut them and even if you burn them, they will sprout quite quickly after you disturb them, right? So you can knock them down, but they won't stay down for long. Another thing, just like we saw with the other plant, is that they're allelopathic. They can put toxins into the soil and change the environment of that soil so that other native plants are unable to survive and thrive in that environment, which makes them all the more likely to take over an area. So we get to our calorie pair, which is one of our more divisive, invasive topics, right? Every time I share this at a talk about invasive, someone always gets mad that it is on the list, but it's on there for good reason, right? It was introduced as an ornamental tree, but you can see it is very pretty, right? But it was also found that it could be used to study disease resistance in some of our other pears that were edible when they're doing genetic modifications, right? Um, you might have also heard this called like a Bradford pear or a Cleveland pear, and they're all the same tree. They're just different cultivars of that same species, right? But regardless of which one you're talking about, it's still invasive, right? They can grow 25 to 35 feet. They do have those nice white showy flowers, but it does come with a lot of downsides. So the branches are relatively weak, right? So they will break if you have any sort of type of heavy weather. They're going to break and not be as nice and structured like that. And on some of the cultivars, their flowers actually smell like rotting fish. And I don't know about you, but when I smell a flower, that is not the smell that I'm going for. But there are lots of great alternatives that you can put in their places, right? So like serviceberries or dogwoods or chokecherries or plums, we have lots of pretty flowering native plants that you can put in that will be much better for a calorie pair. And this one you might have heard most recently in the news because as of 2023, it was officially banned for sale in the state of Ohio. But right before then, of course, sellers had to get rid of their inventory. So there was essentially a liquidation sale. Everything must go. And a lot of them were sold. So around here, at least, I see a lot of like driveways or parkways, right? But if you ever drive down the highway, you might see something that looks like this picture on the left, right? And you know that the state didn't go and plant these calorie pears randomly, but we do see them here, which is just one piece of evidence that they are highly invasive, right? This is one that I have problems with because I love the way honeysuckle smells, but I understand why it's on the list. So it was introduced from Asia as an ornamental, but also for soil control because of its ability to bush out, which it can get 15 feet tall and just as wide. It does have these long oval leaves that have kind of these dramatic tips with these really showy flowers and fruits that smell really, really good. One of the ways you can identify honeysuckle is by when it comes out. So if you're taking a walk in the woods in February or March, right before you think anything is ready to bloom, you'll start seeing little pops of green, and chances are that it is honeysuckle, right? And that's another one of those signs that it is invasive because it's going to come out a lot earlier and start out competing our native plants. The fruits that it produces, it does have high carbs, but it's low in fats and other good nutrients that our animals need as well. Here's Asian bittersweet. If you're familiar with kudzu, which is the invasive that is found down south, this has been deemed the kudzu of the north. It was introduced from Asia as an ornamental vine for obvious reasons, right? It has these really pretty orange berries on there, and in the fall, it's really showy, so it can be used in wreaths or other decorative forms because it is really pretty. But it is a vine, and it's not like a grapevine that's just going to use a tree to hold it up. It's actually going to strangle that tree. So you can see in this picture on the right, it uses that tree to climb up, but as it's doing it, it essentially girdles it, right? Because it squeezes so tightly that it cuts off the tree's ability to get its food and water from its roots. So when it does that, since it's climbing up the tree is dead, so obviously it's weakened, but now you have all this excess weight at the top. So during a storm event, it's likely that those trees will topple over as well, which can be problematic, especially if they're close to your house, right? So their leaves, oh yeah, the upper right picture, I do have a picture of the leaf. They're glossy and rounded and kind of oval shaped. And like I said before, they're known for those fall fruits that you can see in that left side picture. But it is going to strangle the tree that it's attached to. Here's another one that's a little polarizing. First, people are shocked that it's on the list, and then they're mad because they have them in their yard. And I apologize, but there's a reason we're talking about all these, right? It was also introduced from Asia as an ornamental because of that showy color that it gets in the fall. You know, for the summer, it's this really pretty green color, and then in the fall, it turns that vibrant, fiery red color, hence its name, burning bush. But there's some downsides to it, obviously. So if you have it in your yard, usually you're pruning it, but if you leave it unpruned, it can grow up to 15 feet tall, right? The flowers on here are actually quite inconspicuous. They're really small. They really go unnoticed most of the time, but they produce these red fruits as you see on the left, which obviously birds are going to enjoy. And because it's invasive, it's going to crowd out those native plants and reduce biodiversity. And the goal is always biodiversity, right? The more things in nature, the better. We all rely on each other. And again, just like the last one, even though the birds eat the fruits, they don't provide much nutritional value for the birds as well. Okay. So purple loosestrife is on the invasive species list for obvious reasons. It was introduced as an ornamental, but there's other reasons. It's not just one reason like we've seen in the others. So I found it as an ornamental. It was also used for beekeeping because I believe the bees can use it as a nectar source. But also the seeds were in the soil used as ship ballast. And if you're unfamiliar with that concept, ballast is the material that they kept on the ship in order to balance it out and keep it afloat, right? So it affected the weight. So they just put soil in there, and a lot of that soil had these stray seeds in there that they may not have been aware of, right? One problem with this purple loosestrife is that it does have a longer bloom time. So it'll bloom from June all the way through September, which is longer than a lot of our native plants. And with them, they create a taproot. So if you think about taproots, these go down like a carrot, right? And they go deep down in order to reach water, but this plant's taproot can support 30 to 50 different stems, right? And if you have something that big, you can only imagine the amount of seeds that it can produce. So one study found that it can produce between 2 and 3 million seeds per year, right? That's huge. Okay. These are illegal to sell, the fertile varieties in Ohio. But even though you can buy the sterile cultivars, excuse me, those cultivars can crossbreed with the wild varieties and then produce fertile seeds. So even though the ones that are being sold are sterile, if they're able to crossbreed with the wild ones, you're still going to get viable plants, right? So it is problematic still. Our tree of heaven, you might have heard of, right? Especially with the organism I'm going to talk about next. But this was introduced from China as a shade tree and to feed the silkworms. So silkworms did not make it, but tree of heaven unfortunately got out and then did its invasive thing. So these are really good at colonizing disturbed sites, and that's why you'll often see them along railroads, right? If you hike along the hike and bike trail, you're going to see them on that railway corridor. They can reach up to 80 feet tall, which is actually where they get their name from. So you might have thought Tree of Heaven, oh, it's so pretty. That's not actually where its name comes from. It comes from the fact that it reaches up to heaven and gets up so tall, right? About 80 feet, not because of its beauty standards. But when we look at this, remember when we talked about having leaflets, right? So this is the largest pinnately compound leaf in Ohio, and it can have up to about 40 leaflets on one leaf, which is quite a lot, right? If you crush one of those leaves, you'll find that it smells not great, right? One thing compared it to rancid peanut butter, which is pretty gross. So they do not smell good. A lot of times they're confused with staghorn sumac, but there's a lot of differences to look for. The most obvious one would be the number of leaflets, right? So this has close to 40, right? And staghorn sumac is going to have considerably less. And also, staghorn sumac is called that because the buds are and young twigs are furry. These ones are not. And then there's differences in the fruit as well. So this is problematic, right? We know the silkworms died out, but we do have a new insect in town that can feed on the tree of heaven because they came from the same place, and that would be the spotted lanternfly. And this one I'm also a little upset about because I do think it is a beautiful insect, but it can do some terrible work, right? So its egg masses were introduced from Asia because they came over on shipments, and we found that spotted lanternfly do not care where they lay their eggs. They can lay them on pretty much anything. So either on stone shipments or woody plants, that's how they got over here. And it's problematic because um, obviously they can be on the tree of heaven we just talked about, but grapes, apples, hops, right? All of those things that we enjoy, they can cause serious damage too. So these spotted lanternfly are plant hoppers, and because they're hoppers, they're not good flyers, right? But they are problematic because they suck the sap out of the tree, which is going to cause wilting and stress the plant. So the way it was explained to me, like if you have one tick, you're probably going to be okay, right? Like if a tree has one spotted lanternfly, it's going to be fine. But when we find swarms, it would be like having your body covered in tick. Obviously, then it's a problem because if we have swarms of spotted lanternfly sucking the sap out of plants, it's going to cause serious damage. So not only does it cause wilting and stress to the plant, but it also, because of that, makes the plant more susceptible to other diseases. And when they're in those huge colonies, they also create a lot of honeydew, which is their waste, right? And that honeydew is going to attract other insects and fungi, which can also cause more problems for the plant. And one issue we're finding is that they, at least with identification, is that they look different at every stage of their life. So if you look at the left, we have an egg mass, and that's a covered up one, right? But if you continue on, you can see the nymphs are in different colors at different stages. And then the adult. So this is the adult with its wings open on the bottom, and on the top, that's the adult with its wings closed. And they all look very different. But once you learn to identify them, the not advice, but usually the instructions is to squash on site, right? So kill first, ask questions, and take photos later because they are causing this much of a problem, especially when they're attacking these high profile plants like we have here. Okay, continuing on, we have a common in Japanese barberry, which was brought over from Russia as an ornamental. And as you can see in this photo, it just takes over and creates a big cover plant. And if you're a cover plant, then you're going to cover more than just the ground, right? Small animals are going to like to be under there to provide habitat and protection from predators. What they're finding is that this is one of the favorite covers for the white-footed mouse, right? And they've found that where there is an abundance of barberry, there would be an abundance of white-footed mouse, which leads to an abundance of ticks, right? So if you don't want ticks, that means you need to get rid of the barberry because you're just allowing the organisms that carry them into your yard to bring them into your yard, right? The common barberry specifically is a host for black stem rust, which affects our grains, right? So if we lose our grains, obviously it's a huge problem in Ohio. And both of them have spines, so this can make removal kind of problematic. Okay. So our Norway maple is a maple that was introduced from Europe as an ornamental, right? It is a pretty kind of shapely tree. They can grow 40 to 60 feet tall. But it's problematic because they can crowd out our native maples that we want, like the sugar maple, right? If you don't have sugar maples, then you don't have maple syrup. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. And because it is a maple, it's not always evident that it is invasive, but to kind of put it in perspective, um, it, the Cleveland Metro Parks has it listed as one of the 12 invasive species that is of the highest priority to eradicate from their parks, right? So if it's on their list of the top 12 to get rid of, then you know it's pretty bad. Okay, moving on to one of the showier ones is Lesser Celandine, which is obviously brought over as an ornamental because it is quite pretty. It has these little flowers that have about 8 petals, but it's really low growing and it can really form a carpet or a mat on the forest floor. It is considered ephemeral because it comes up in the spring and it doesn't last very long, but it can still do quite a bit of damage in that short time because of its ability to take over large areas. So it forms this carpet and it rolls along the forest floor, but the problem is it'll roll right over our natives, right? So spring beauties, May apples, Canada Mayflower, um, any of the other pretty wildflowers that you want to see in the spring, this will bowl right over it, right? And then once it's done, like I said, it's ephemeral. It gets pollinated and then it dies back. Now you have this whole area that's able to be colonized by other weedy species in the area, right? So Phragmites is one you might have heard of. Phragmites is actually the genus name. It's also called common reed. Um, but it was first noticed in coastal ports and then spread along transportation routes. So brought over on ships in those coastal areas, and now you can see it all along roadsides. It can grow in really inhospitable areas. I've seen it growing up out of the cracks on the highway, right? But it does thrive in wetlands and low areas. But the problem is it does create a monoculture because it grows so tightly, right? You can see here, you can barely tell where one plant starts and the other one begins on that left-hand side picture. So it'll grow tightly, which inhibits the ability of other plants to grow, but it also grows tall, so it'll block the other plants from getting sun as well. And it's not just a problem for plants, it's a problem for animals as well, right? So if you look at that picture on the left again, imagine being like a turtle trying to crawl through there, right? You're not going to make it. So that can really impede your ability to survive if you're trying to get away from a predator or make it to a food source or anything like that. Border privet is one you might have seen. So brought over from Europe as a shrub and also as a natural hedge because it can produce these big bushy areas and grow up to about 16 feet tall. If you look at the picture on the right, it does make these white clusters of flowers that are going to be fertilized and then turned into that dark berry you see on the left-hand side. And if you've ever gone out in the winter, these berries often tend to persist into the winter as well. But just like Phragmites, these are going to form dense thickets and crowd out the natives that would otherwise be there and provide real nutritious fruits to our animals. And this is another one that people like to argue with me about because they just don't understand how earthworms can be invasive, right? But any of the last remaining earthworms that we had in this area were removed by the last ice age, right? So the ones that we have now were brought over from Europe and Asia by settlers or like that ship ballast that we talked about previously. So it's um, the majority of earthworms in our area are the invasive kind, right? So yes, we know that earthworms, they can be good in like vermiculture, and they do create pore space in soil, right? Which is good. But when you have heavy infestations of them, they actually impact the soil in a negative way because that microhabitat can be altered. And they provide challenges for anything relying on the soil, right? And in some cases, they can increase soil erosion. So we found that when people go fishing, if they, don't, if they're done fishing and they're not going to go fishing again soon, they just kind of dump out the worms there on the bank. And what they found is that the banks around the water's edge are being eroded because of these earthworms. So, okay. So in case you didn't notice I just talked about what invasives are in our area. I did not cover how to remove them, right? If you want to do that, that would be a whole separate webinar. But there are some places where you can get information on that if you are having problems with these. So the Ohio Invasive Plant Council is a great group that has a wonderful website that has information on everything I talked about. Well, the plants that I talked about rather, but how to remove them, what they look like, anything you might need to know. And they go into like manual control or chemical control or even sometimes biological control. So they have a lot of good information. Of course, the OSU Extension Office has great information. Our natural areas steward recommended the Problem Plants Ohio, that book there on the left. So you can use that to get information. And if you want to make changes in your yard and start getting rid of the invasives, my favorite book is The Midwestern Native Garden because it highlights the invasives that are in the area, but then gives you a list of native plants you can put in their spot. So if you're going to remove them, it already comes with a list of what you can put back in their spot. And that's the end. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to stick around. But otherwise, thank you for hanging out with me and learning about our invasive instigators tonight. Have a good night.